We've all been there. You join a match of 2042, you pop open the scoreboard, and the Eclipse is going 57-1 in his Nightbird. Oh, fuck. I'm the problem now, aren't I? 3 years ago, I put out an anti-vehicle guide for Battlefield 4, fully expecting it to crash and burn. And despite the fact that I thought it was going to crash and burn, over the course of 3 years, that video has somehow racked up over 100,000 views and helped thousands of people deal with different vehicles in Battlefield 4. Considering that in the last 3 years I've been playing a ton of Battlefield 2042, and also considering that the game isn't really getting patches anymore and it's mostly towards the end of its life, I think it's important that I make another anti-vehicle guide, this time for the most recent Battlefield game. And just like with Battlefield 4's anti-vehicle guide, I'm gonna cut the crap and start with the most important stuff right off the bat to not waste your time. To put it bluntly, when it comes to land vehicles especially, the best thing in the entire game that is criminally underused is the underbarrel AP grenade launcher. This thing is absurd, and the fact that almost every single person playing the game isn't running one is, well, it boggles my mind. The underbarrel AP launcher is a grenade launcher that you can put on the following weapons: the AK-24, the SCAR, the AK-5C, LCMG, DFR Strife, and SVK. Now obviously, this limited weapon pool is probably the reason why we don't see nearly as many of these grenade launchers in use. That being said, I highly recommend, if you're going out of your way to get rid of vehicles, that you use the AP grenade launcher. You'll notice that in practically every single clip that I'm going to show you of taking out vehicles, the grenade launcher is going to be involved in some way because it is just that good. Generally speaking, the grenade launcher does around 18 damage to your standard main battle tank. That means that with 2 of them, you can do 36 damage to a tank pretty much for free. Because the thing is that the projectile velocity on this is surprisingly fast, and not only that, the reload speed is extremely solid. And of course, naturally, pretty much the best quirk about the grenade launcher is the fact that you can use it on any class. This includes the medic class, which can run ammo crates, which means that in theory, if you're fighting a vehicle, you can be firing 3 of these at the vehicle at any given time, considering you can immediately resupply after firing 1. That's 54 damage to a tank by yourself as somebody who isn't even an engineer. The end-all be-all is, this is an integral part of taking out vehicles in 2042, and if you're dedicating your time to taking them out, you need one, period. Now, if you're going through these guns and you're not sure which one you want to use, my personal recommendation is the AK-5C. I'll be showing my loadout on screen now if you just don't have the time to try to go through gun building and are not sure what to use. That being said, literally any of these weapons that can equip the AP launcher are all good guns, so you can't really go wrong with any of the ones you pick. There is one other constant when it comes to taking out vehicles in 2042, and that's this bad boy right here. The UV2 Pondhawk, or as I refer to it as, the funny vehicle, is one of the best things at dealing with literally any type of vehicle in the game, whether it be a ground vehicle or an aircraft. I'll be talking about it more in depth when we get to those specific sections, but in short, this little flying bicycle can be used to simply sit above a vehicle so it otherwise can't hit you and just pepper it with whatever munitions you have. Several of the vehicles in the game have just about 0 counterplay to this. Anyways, let's get into more specifics, and the first thing that we're going to be talking about, just like with the BF4 anti-vehicle guide, is how to deal with ground vehicles. And naturally, we'll be starting with the most common way to deal with ground vehicles, and that's rocket launchers. Now, the very last thing that I want to talk about before we talk about all of the different rocket launchers in the game is Crawford. This is the only engineer that you should run if you're running a rocket launcher. Period, bar none. If you are using BORRIS, I'm sorry, you're bad at the game. BORRIS is not a good operator, and having an extra rocket in your rocket launcher is invaluable to taking out armor. Stop playing BORRIS, he's not good, play Crawford instead, please God. Anyways, we're gonna start with the worst rocket launcher on the list, the SRAW. Now, I made a video a while back about how the SRAW was the worst rocket launcher in the game after they added it. Since then, it's been buffed, and it's still the worst rocket launcher in the game. Go figure. To basically reiterate a lot of the things that I said in this video, the problem with the SRAW is that its reload time isn't any better than any of the other rocket launchers in the game, it doesn't do any more damage than the other rocket launchers in the game, and it has less rockets than all of the other rocket launchers in the game. If you want raw stats, the SRAW does 27 damage to the side of the tank, and you only get 3 rockets. That means that even if you land every single rocket against a tank, you are physically incapable of destroying it by yourself. That is very questionable. Now, of course, the main gimmick of the SRAW is the fact that you can guide the rocket, and so I assume that's the reason why it has less rockets. In practice, against land vehicles, there are very few opportunities where you need to turn the rocket. And that's because the overall rocket launcher projectile speed in this game for all of the other rockets is really fast. It's not hard to hit targets at relatively medium distance. And so the introduction of being able to turn your rockets is just not all that helpful. If you're a SRAW god and you're shooting aircraft out of the sky, maybe you could rationalize yourself to use the SRAW, but when it comes to your average run-of-the-mill player, don't touch this thing with a 10-foot pole. It is not worth it whatsoever. It's just sort of bad and you don't want it. Now fortunately, it's all uphill from here, and the next rocket on the list is the Javelin. See, aside from the SRAW, none of the rocket launchers in this game are objectively bad, and they all sort of have their purpose. That being said, the Javelin's purpose can be a little bit rough. The main gimmick here is the fact that you need to lock on in order to fire your rocket. If you do manage to lock on and fire, the Javelin does 44 damage, which is high and above the most out of any other rocket launcher in the game. And considering you get 4 rockets, which is the same amount that you're going to get with the RPG, which I'll be talking about in a moment, in theory, the Javelin can do a ton of damage to vehicles. That's not even considering the fact that laser designations, which I won't really be touching on too much because they're far weaker in this game than they have been in previous games. But that being said, with laser designations, this thing can do even more damage and hit things through walls. It's just quite good at dealing with that. The problem is that most vehicles in this game feel like they were directly equipped to deal with the Javelin. What I mean by that is every vehicle player worth their weight is running 2 things on their vehicle. The active protection system, which blocks any projectiles that are coming at you, and the thermal smoke, which immediately breaks off any lock-ons that are fired at you. The thing is, while APS works perfectly well against any of the rockets in the game, the thermal smoke isn't going to do anything to someone using an RPG, TV missile, recoilless M5, or a SRAW. That being said, with the Javelin, if they hit their smoke button, you've lost a rocket. So basically, in layman's terms, what this means is if you're going up against a tank with the Javelin, you fire your first rocket, they smoke it. You fire your second rocket, and they use their APS. Okay, well now you only have 2 rockets left, and you only do 44 damage a shot. That means that we've got the SRAW problem once again. You physically cannot do enough damage to kill this vehicle. And that's all assuming that it's just letting you sit there constantly locking onto it and firing at it, which in practice is just not going to happen most of the time. But the real killer for the Javelin is the fact that just about everything in the entire game will make it so you can't lock on. It's an extremely frustrating thing with all of the lock-ons in 2042, but attempting to get that lock-on can be a real pain in the ass. You're probably seeing a clip in the background of me trying to lock onto an AA, and because these leaves are in my way, it doesn't work. That is infuriating, and basically invalidates the launcher on a lot of maps. If you are trying to use the Javelin, you're going to want to get some high ground, rain some death from above, and not necessarily expect to get a whole lot of kills, but certainly put on the damage. Now we're moving up to the real heavy hitters, and really the next 2 are sort of a toss-up. The first is the Recoilless M5. The M5 was the first rocket launcher added to Battlefield 2042, and it's also probably the most standard. You carry the most rockets with this one, starting off with 5 of them, and they each do 27 damage each to the side of a tank. That puts you at a very solid 135 potential damage with your rocket right from the get-go. Now there are 2 other handy things about the M5 that make it a worthy choice. The first is the overall projectile velocity, with the M5 having the fastest projectile velocity in the game. The other is the scope, which is sort of a double-edged sword. So the thing about the M5 is that it has a, I believe, 4x scope on it, which when firing at things in a distance can be really helpful, but when it starts to get close up, yeah, that can be an issue. That being said, the really nifty thing about the scope is that it actually works. And by that I mean the notches that you have on the scope are accurate to the meterage that you need to fire it at. So you'll have instances like this clip where I can see something about 500 meters away, I use the notches correctly, and bam, no more helicopter from over 500 meters. That's something that you just can't do with any of the other rockets in the game, and it feels oh so satisfying to pull off. That being said, there is a bit of a quirk with the M5, and that's that the projectile that you see is not necessarily accurate to where the projectile actually is. A problem that I don't really see with any of the other rockets. As you can see in this clip right here, the rocket just very clearly clips straight through this jet. I'm not entirely sure what causes this, and it's one of the big things that leads me to not necessarily use the M5 as much as I probably otherwise would, because not having accurate visual feedback makes leading targets and figuring out the correct lead very difficult. It's hard to adjust when you don't know what you're adjusting for. Overall though, the M5 is a solid pick, and I can totally see why people pick it over the RPG. That being said, the next rocket launcher that I want to talk about is just that, the RPG, which is high and above my favorite free fire rocket in the game. The RPG has 4 rockets when you're playing as Crawford, and each of those rockets can deal 35 damage, which is a pretty sizable increase all things considered compared to the 27 damage of the M5 and most of the other rockets in the game. Now, the reason that I personally prefer the RPG over the Recoilless M5 is because of that slightly extra damage. The reason that having this extra damage is really solid at the end of the day, because generally speaking when you're fighting against a ground vehicle, there should be 2 objectives in your mind. Obviously, the first objective is destroy the vehicle, but the secondary objective is do as much damage as you can so that way a potential teammate can come up and finish it off. Soloing vehicles is all well and good, but in most games of Battlefield, you're going to have 31 to 63 other players on your team that also might have ways of dealing with the vehicle. And the thing to consider is that you want to do as much damage in as little time as possible, because the other major issue that you could run into is the tank simply running away and healing itself, making you lose all of your damage. In most instances, if I'm using an RPG, I can usually get a shot off and then immediately fire a grenade launcher, which has a tendency of doing around 50 plus damage. This means that in one interaction, I've already chunked away 50% of a tank's health before it's even reacted. And in these situations, that's a hell of a lot less work for somebody else coming up to deal with. Now the catch here is that you obviously have to be a little bit more careful with your rockets because you have less of them. If you fire a rocket into somebody's APS unknowingly or you start whiffing, that can be an issue. But overall, I think the RPG is simply the best pick when it comes to these rockets. It does have one little quirk that I can't not mention, which is the fact that when you initially take it out, the equipping animation takes a really long time. You can still fire the RPG while doing the animation though, and it does go straight. You can see this when you ADS immediately after taking it out, and your ADS will be all wonky. Remember that if you ADS and fire, as long as the enemy is in the center of the screen, you'll be hitting them anyway. Now, the final rocket that we have to talk about, and the one at the top of the tier list ever since she's been added, and that is the TV missile from LIS. This thing is incredible, and while it's certainly not the best at soloing vehicles, it has the highest utility by far, and in my opinion is just the best rocket launcher. The TV missile does exactly what it says. It fires out a missile that you can control with your mouse or your controller. And because of this, you can directly guide the missile from any piece of cover to whatever target you need to hit. The TV missile does 27 damage no matter where you hit the target, and you get 2 rockets available at any given time. This may initially sound bad, and you're probably thinking to yourself, well, hey, wait a minute, Eclipse. If you only get 2 rockets and only do 27 damage, then this has the same problem as the SRAW, doesn't it? You simply can't kill a vehicle by yourself. And that is to an extent true, except for the fact that now, since you're using LIS and your rocket launcher is your class gadget rather than something you directly equip, it also means that you can cap this off with your grenade launchers, and you can equip C5. This, in my opinion, is the best overall loadout when it comes to dealing with ground vehicles. An AP launcher, TV missiles, and C5. With this, LIS has a total of around 204 total explosive damage at her fingertips at any given time, including the ability to deal with any of the vehicles in the game in multiple different ways. But the real kicker for the TV missile is the fact that, unlike all the other rockets in the game, because this is LIS's class gadget, it recharges over time. Which means you may only have 2 TV missiles at any given time, but the second you fire one, it starts giving you one back for free. Sometimes finding ammo on the battlefield can be easier said than done, so having unlimited rockets is really something. And with a range of 475 meters, you can be an absolute menace on the battlefield. Even if you're not directly killing vehicles, 2 shots of the TV missile is doing almost half their health, and that is going to scare the crap out of any vehicle player. Now, I do have two final notes on rocket launchers. The first is reload speed, and the second is a bit more complex. When it comes to reload speeds, as I've covered in a previous video, all of the rocket launchers have extremely similar, if not identical, reload speeds. So really all you're taking into consideration when it comes to your choice is the amount of damage and the amount of rockets, as well as obviously the way that you actually fire it. You can also consider the fact that technically the TV missile and the SRAW have longer reload times because you need to guide the rocket, and while you're doing that, you're not reloading. But overall, the reload times are really not that much of an issue. And finally, one thing that you need to remember in order to keep your sanity when going up against vehicles is sometimes you can just do everything right and still lose. The reality of the day is if you're going up against a tank by yourself as a soldier, you're not necessarily expected to win. And especially if you're in a situation where you're going up against multiple soldiers in a tank, you're probably gonna lose. So don't go into these fights expecting to win because, oh, I have the best loadout for the job. Sometimes things just don't go your way even if you've done everything right. And the thing is that the opposite is often true. Sometimes you don't really do anything right. You just happen upon circumstance and win by default. Battlefield is a very random game, and it helps to remember that while you're playing. You can try to control as many odds as you can, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. Now, in my Battlefield 4 guide, I mentioned landmines. And when I mentioned those landmines, I said they were mostly worthless. And in Battlefield 2042, this is still mostly true. Landmines in this game are admittedly better than Battlefield 4, but not by a whole lot. This stems from the fact that, unlike in Battlefield 4, the drivers of vehicles don't have thermals, so they can't just immediately see the landmines all the time. That being said, they're not exactly hard to see, and most good players aren't going to get killed by them. But you can also consider the fact that due to crossplay and the overall larger player base in total of the players on 2042, there's a lot more bad players. And that means that landmines are a hell of a lot more effective. Bad players love running into landmines, so unlike in the Battlefield 4 guide, I won't tell you directly not to use landmines, and I will say if you're using the list strategy, you can replace the C5 with landmines if you want. It's not a horrible strategy. Now, that being said, there has been one thing drastically missing from this video, and that's the C4 Jeep. Where's the C4 Jeep, Eclipse?
Explosive set!
Well, unfortunately, 2042 C4 Jeep fucking sucks. It's just really bad. I don't know what they did to this thing. They butchered it. It feels like half the time, or correction, 80% of the time, it just doesn't work, and I don't really know why. I have managed to find a little bit of success by putting the C4 in these specific areas underneath the axles of the Jeep, and that has a tendency of working sometimes. But considering the fact that you need to wait for the vehicle cooldown every time you want a Jeep, so you can't just constantly get Jeeps over and over again, and the fact that sometimes it just doesn't work, well, the C4 Jeep is sorta dead. Or is it? While the C4 Jeep may be dead, the C5 Funny is here in full force. That's right, Battlefield 2042 has an even more effective C4 Jeep, and that is the C5 Funny vehicle. This thing is an absolute menace, and can basically get rid of any ground vehicle in an instant aside from maybe the Ram because of how fast it is. Spread out the C5 as much as possible to make sure that in the events where it doesn't instantly kill the vehicle, it does at least enough damage so that way I can finish it off. And the general rule of thumb here is very simple. You crash the Funny into the front of the vehicle and detonate. Kablamo. No more vehicle. The only unfortunate factor is the fact that because all chat is off by default, you don't get nearly as many salty babies as in Battlefield 4, but God, it is still hilarious. My personal recommendation is to use the C5 Funny against dipshits who camp in the back of their spawn with the AA. They think they're safe back there. So, go back there and show them how safe they really are. Unsurprisingly, there are a few hiccups to this strategy, like the fact that if someone starts shooting at you with lock-on missiles, you could really be in trouble. And the fact that sometimes the C5 is just inconsistent and you'll blow it up and it just won't do any damage. Some of this can be remedied by having somebody on your Funny that's directly detonating it, because then you don't have to get off, and so you don't have to go through the animation of taking out your explosives and then detonating it. But at the end of the day, doing this alone, perfectly serviceable, extremely effective, and if you're really having a hard time dealing with something that's a ground vehicle and isn't a Ram, this is pretty much a surefire way to automatically win. Now, before we move on to the next topic of dealing with aircraft, there is one final note that I want to mention about dealing with ground vehicles. And that's the vehicles themselves. Or, most notably, the MKV-90 Tor, or as most people refer to it, the railgun tank. This is, hands down, the best way to deal with ground vehicles, and obviously, it's kind of cheating because it's a vehicle in of itself. That being said, the Tor tank shoots straight through the active protection systems of any of the enemy vehicles. It also does a boatload of damage to any of those vehicles. So much so that it does like 95 damage to the Ram. That's scary. So if you're really, really, really struggling with vehicles, just hop into one of these. It was basically solely designed to be shit against infantry and dumpster vehicles, and that's exactly what it does. Now, we get to move on to dealing with aircraft. In my Battlefield 4 video, I started off by talking about how absolutely worthless this pile of crap is. And unsurprisingly, in this game, it's mostly no different. If you're equipping the Stinger to deal with aircraft, you are more than likely completely wasting your time. 99% of the time, if the person you're going up against isn't completely incompetent, you'll lock on, fire your rocket, they'll use flares, hide behind a building, and come back with flares again. And guess what? Now they're coming straight for you, and you're dead. As I said in that video, all equipping a Stinger does is make it so that way the pilot is going to go out of their way to kill you, which sort of defeats the whole purpose of trying to deal with the helicopter if all you're doing is making it kill you more. That being said, the Stinger is not completely useless in this game, because the funny vehicle is back. At this point, this is notorious, and despite it being relatively notorious to the better players of the game, a lot of noobs aren't doing this. So if you're a noob, here's your PSA. The funny vehicle, when being paired with the FXM-33AA missile, is a menace, and is basically a surefire way to deal with any below average to mediocre pilot. And honestly, even some good pilots on a lot of maps. All you really need to do is fly straight up to the sky limit, switch over to the second seat, pull out your rocket launcher, lock on, and the rest is history. This is unsurprisingly way easier if you have somebody else to drive the vehicle for you, so that way you're not just constantly switching back and forth. But doing it solo is 100% within the realm of possibility. There are some pilots out there, looking in a mirror right now, that are able to deal with this. Whether it be directly going underneath buildings or something in order to dodge your rockets, or simply driving so far out of bounds that you can't follow them. But for the most part, if the pilot isn't a complete sweat, this is gonna take him out. Now, that's the lock-ons, but the real way you deal with aircraft is not lock-ons, and everybody knows it. The real way you deal with aircraft is the best anti-aircraft tool that has ever been added into any Battlefield game to date. We're once again circling back around to Liss's TV missile. Now I know, I'm gonna hear it all over the place. Eclipse, I don't have 400 hours to learn how to aim my TV missiles. Eclipse, I'm not good with TV missiles. Eclipse, yada 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 yada. Well, guess what? You're either gonna get good with TV missiles or you're gonna lose. Seriously though, the TV missile is so absurdly strong. It can kill the Nightbird and the stealth helicopter in a single shot and deals 80 damage to the attack helicopter. Now obviously I don't expect everyone to be able to just be nailing every single TV missile shot, but here's what I'll tell you. If you're constantly locking on, directly attracting the enemy straight to you and then getting killed, how is that any more helpful than firing TV missiles, slowly getting better over time, and eventually getting to the point where you can land them? It's really no secret at all at this point that the TV missile is the best way to go about dealing with aircraft, and so my best recommendation to you is to just try to improve. I can give some tips and tricks when it comes to pointers though, and my first is to stay further away from your target. My experience is that the further away you are, the easier it is to land. Not only that, but boost immediately. And here's why. The TV missile makes a very loud and obvious audio cue that it's coming at you. And the more time that somebody has to listen to that and then dodge out of the way, the less likely you are to hit them. If you boost straight away, in a lot of cases, people will have little to no heads up that the rocket is even coming for them. And it's in this moment where you have the highest chance of hitting them. And my final recommendation when it comes to TV missiles is to overshoot always. This might just be a me-specific problem, but I have a really bad habit of constantly undershooting over and over and over again. Because the helicopter is moving, it's often easier to correct an overshoot than it is an undershoot because their momentum is going to continue to travel them in whatever way they're going. So overshooting, usually the way to go. Overall though, like I said, you just need to get used to the TV missile, and once you are, well, that's a cinch. Of course, you can still get lucky taking down aircraft, whether it be using the RPG or the Recoilless M5, and the SRAW is also there. When it comes to dealing with attack helicopters especially, sometimes hitting them with 2 TV missiles is easier said than done, and there are solutions to that problem. The first is of course the SRAW. If you manage to hit it with one, it's gone. The other is the railgun. This thing is really handy because you can slowly chip away the attack helicopter's health until it's in the threshold where it'll get one shot by a TV missile. Generally speaking, my rule of thumb when it comes to attack helicopters is this exact strategy. Shoot it a bunch with a railgun, then hit it with one TV missile and it's gone. Because if you hit it with a TV missile when it has full health and it takes 80 damage and runs away, that feels like crap. And it's at this point that I will definitely mention the laser designations that I said I wasn't going to touch on too much, and I'm still not really going to. Laser designation, when combined with either the RPG or the Recoilless M5, is a pretty solid way of destroying enemy helicopters, assuming they're not paying a whole lot of attention. You can sort of cheese this system, and that's because of how fast those rockets move. If you're close up to an enemy designated helicopter and fire a free fire rocket, a lot of the time they'll just get killed before they can even react. And even if they press flares, they'll get hit anyway. A nifty little thing that you can do is if you hack the enemy aircraft, that will also designate it. And while the enemy is hacked, they can't hear the sound nor see the indicator of when you've actually fired a missile. They can hear that they're being locked onto, but they can't hear when you shoot it. And because there's no missile indicator on the missile itself with a free fire rocket when you lock on, a lot of the time you can catch people off guard because they won't even know if you fired a rocket until, well, it's too late. Now, once again, we're going to be paralleling the Battlefield 4 video, and we're going to talk about the actual, real, most consistent way to deal with aircraft in the game, the mobile AA. Yeah, it's called mobile anti-aircraft for a reason, because it destroys aircraft. As long as you have some sort of game sense, no aircraft should ever realistically kill you while you're in this thing. Doesn't mean it won't happen, doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's not realistic if you're paying attention. If an aircraft gets anywhere remotely near you, they're gonna show up on your radar, so you'll be able to see them. And as long as you have the active protection system unlocked, you can basically turn off the enemy's ability to hit you while you can just light them up. The problem with the anti-aircraft and with players in the game is oftentimes they'll just sit in the spawn with it, and that's not helping anybody. Because if you're sitting in the spawn with the mobile AA, then the enemy helicopter can farm the entire middle of the map and you're not really doing a whole lot to stop them. The best way to use the AA is exactly what you would expect. You need to put the AA in the places where the helicopter doesn't want you to be. And most of the time, that's by your team. If you're hanging out with the AA by the rest of your team, your odds of getting absolutely swamped by enemies is not very high because you've got your entire team around you. And not only that, you're being a deterrent to the enemy helicopter. Even if you're not directly killing it, it doesn't want to go near you, and so you're stopping it from farming the rest of your teammates. Some helicopters, like the Nightbird, literally can't kill you if you're in the AA. They only get one lock-on missile at a time, and you can just flare it or use APS, and by the time they get another one, you can have flares or APS back. It can't kill you. It's impossible. My personal loadout for the AA is the 35mm cannon and the anti-tank missiles because I use it very aggressively and also have a tendency of engaging ground vehicles as well. But if you're just looking for dealing with aircraft, I recommend the exact opposite. Go with the AA missiles, pop on the default cannon, and shred anything out of the sky. Now, the other parallel to the Battlefield 4 video, if you're trying to deal with aircraft, use the jet. Yeah, I know. Eclipse, I'm not good with jets. Eclipse, I can't use jets. I'm bad with them. But if you get good with the jets in the game, which doesn't take that long if you just hop into a bot match and fly around for a bit, you can completely trivialize every other air vehicle in the game. It's unsurprising that the jet is a hard counter to all of the helicopters, and that includes the Nightbird if you're good enough. If you're looking for strictly AA, you can just pop on the active radar missiles along with the 20mm cannon, and the active radar missiles don't even really require you to aim at all. You just fire it in the general direction of the aircraft, and if they don't have flares, you're probably gonna get a hit. It's completely skillless, it doesn't require basically any effort, and as long as you don't crash, you're gonna be a serious pain in the ass. At the end of the day, the jet is pretty much the best way about dealing with aircraft, and that's not hugely surprising. Now, we've talked in a lot of general terms about so many different ways to deal with the different aircraft and the different vehicles in Battlefield 2042, but there are some vehicles that I feel like require specifics, because these are the real problem areas that people mostly run into and the vast majority of the time simply can't deal with. And they all have specific direct counterplay that I don't see too many people enacting. And so our first stop on this deep dive into specific vehicles is the Nightbird. This thing is notorious. It's the thing that all the sweats use to ruin your day, and if you've played against it constantly, it probably has pissed you off to no end several times. And the thing about the Nightbird is because of how maneuverable it is, even someone like me who's spent hours and hours and hours in the TV missiles still has a hard time hitting them out of the sky a lot of the time if the pilot is skilled. But that doesn't mean that the Nightbird doesn't have any counterplay, because, oh boy, yes it does. As I already mentioned, the AA is effectively immune to the Nightbird. But what's also immune to the Nightbird is the Cav Brawler. And this thing is a Nightbird's worst enemy. And here's why. The secondary weapon slot for the Cav Brawler can equip a flak gun. This thing does a ton of damage to the Nightbird. If you have someone competent gunning in the flak gun on the Cav Brawler, you basically completely shut the Nightbird out of whatever point you're on. It is just about the ultimate Nightbird deterrent, and as I've said before, because the Nightbird only gets one rocket at any given time, just like with the AA, it can't kill you. So you're effectively a driving anti-Nightbird device. Grab the Brawler, make sure it's always nearby your teammates, and ideally have a gunner who's worth a damn, and that Nightbird isn't going to be able to do shit. An honorable mention for making Nightbird's lives miserable is the flak cannon on the Ram. I believe this is also present on the Wildcat, although personally I don't really think it's worth using there considering that the Wildcat already has so many AA capabilities. But you can pop this thing on the back of your Ram as well, and it serves a very similar purpose to the Brawler, albeit it's a little less consistent. Speaking of the Ram, this is the other problem vehicle that I think we need to talk about. The Ram is the ultimate ground vehicle noob slayer. If there's any ground vehicle that you're going to see going on a massive kill streak, it's this one. Effectively, I dubbed this thing the Clan Kid Mobile, because 80% of the time there's some epic gamer clan on the other team, they're driving around one of these things. That being said, despite what a lot of people might tell you, the Ram actually has a ton of counterplay. And that pretty much all stems from its low health pool. The Ram as a vehicle does not have a lot of health, and it can die extremely quickly if you know what you're doing. The number one most slept on anti-Ram development is the NTW sniper rifle. This anti-tank sniper rifle against pretty much every other vehicle in the game is mediocre at best, and because of that, I didn't even bother to mention it up until now. For the most part, it does like maybe 5 to 8 damage per shot, and by the time you do any meaningful damage, you should have just been using an AP grenade launcher or a rocket launcher. That being said, against the Ram, it does a ton of damage. We're talking potentially 16 damage a shot, up to over 20 damage a shot if you hit a critical hit. Critical hits are something that I haven't really mentioned because most of the time they don't make a huge difference. If you do manage to hit a vehicle in the back, it'll do extra damage, but unlike in Battlefield 4, the opportunity that this presents is not as huge. Regardless, the NTW is really good because not only does it do a lot of damage, but because it's a bullet-based weapon, the APS of the Ram isn't going to stop any of the shots. So when it comes to taking out Rams, here's my advice. If you're looking for straight burst damage, throw on an RPG as well as the NTW. When you see the Ram show up, shoot it with an RPG and then immediately start peppering it with NTW shots. If you catch it in a bad spot, you can just straight up kill it just like that. However, if your team is relatively competent and they are firing rockets at the Ram, it's just not working because the Ram APSs and then runs away, that's where the other strategy comes in. Everyone welcome SRAW. SRAW for the most part is just an alright specialist, but against the Ram specifically, he's real good. That's because SRAW's hacking ability that he has lets him turn off APS on any vehicle that currently has it active. Obviously, if a Ram charges into a point, throws on APS and goes, haha, I'm invincible, and then you hack it and turn it off, yeah, he's in a lot of trouble. Not only that, but hacking disables all of the vehicle's internal systems, making it drive way slower. So not only does it not have APS, but it's significantly slower trying to run away. When you combine the ability to hack it with teammates that are potentially shooting at it, and the NTW, which can do a boatload of damage, and the Ram really doesn't stand a chance. And, well, that's pretty much the end of the video. I think these are really the only two big problem vehicles that I see people really struggling to deal with, so I hope that this more in-depth breakdown of direct counterplay strategies can help a few of you out. As with the Battlefield 4 video, I'm sure this video will criminally underperform right after I put it out. And the odds of me getting as lucky as I did with the Battlefield 4 video, well, I can't see them being super high. But that being said, just like with that video, as long as I help 1 or 2 people take out a tank or a helicopter, I think it's worth it. If you watch this video and you maybe have your own tips or tricks when it comes to dealing with vehicles, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll be really interested to see if there are other things that I somehow haven't seen despite all of my time played on this game. I'm always looking to learn new things and come up with new strategies, so if you've got them, send them down there. That being said, we're pretty much done here. Naturally, if you enjoyed the video, learned something, you can leave a like and subscribe. If you didn't, don't. And with all that being said, have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you guys next time.